Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into a powerful and thought-provoking story that had the entire country talking. When tech entrepreneur Darius Bell appeared on live television, he expected tough questions, but what he got was an attempt to discredit his success. What happened next? His response changed everything. This isn't just a story about one man, it's a conversation about success, merit, and the challenges that come with breaking barriers. So stick around, because you won't want to miss this. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share where you're watching from in the comments section. Your support will help us bring more meaningful stories like this. She had planned to discredit him in front of millions. What she hadn't planned for was his response, one that would change everything. It started with a single email, arriving late in the afternoon, its subject line simple and to the point. Invitation to the morning exchange. The message itself was short, formal, and impersonal, extending an invitation for Darius Bell, CEO of Innovis, to be a guest on the show's upcoming segment about diversity in business. Darius had seen this kind of outreach before. Every few months, a major media platform would remember that Black entrepreneurs existed, slotting one into a segment for a few moments of feel-good storytelling before moving on to the next trending topic. But this time felt different. Innovis wasn't some fledgling startup, it was a rising giant, a company that had just secured a multi-million-dollar defense contract, an achievement that sent ripples through the industry. They had outbid some of the biggest names in the game, and that wasn't because of luck or charity. It was the result of 2 decades of tireless effort, innovation, and strategy. So why now? Why this sudden interest from a mainstream talk show? Darius sat at his desk rereading the email. Something about it made him hesitate. "You sure you want to do this?" his assistant, Tasha, asked, her sharp gaze fixed on him. She had worked with him long enough to know his instincts were rarely wrong. These shows love a success story, but they love tearing one down even more. Darius exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "I'll handle it," he said, though even he wasn't sure yet what handling it would look like. "Besides, it's national exposure. Let's see what they have to say." Tasha didn't look convinced. "Just don't let them bait you." He nodded. He knew the game well. If this was a setup, they were playing chess with the wrong man. The morning of the interview, Darius arrived at KXNT Studios in Los Angeles. The green room was sleek but sterile, its cool air humming with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine. A young producer greeted him with barely a glance up from her clipboard. "Mr. Bell, thanks for being here. We'll mic you up in 5. No small talk, no warm-up, just in and out, like a transaction." As he sat in the makeup chair, an assistant dusted his face with powder, her movements mechanical. His gaze drifted to the monitor on the wall, which displayed the show's live broadcasts, a panel segment on celebrity scandals, a cooking demonstration, then a transition card. Coming up next, the black tech boom. Is it talent or special treatment? Darius clenched his jaw. So this was the angle. He adjusted his suit jacket, his mind shifting into high gear. If they thought they had the upper hand, they were in for a surprise. The set of the morning exchange was designed to feel inviting. Soft blues and warm golds. A glass coffee table strategically placed between the host's chair and the guests. Cameras hovered like silent sentinels, capturing every movement, every flicker of expression. Darius took his seat across from Madeline Royce, the show's lead anchor. She was a seasoned journalist with a reputation for asking tough, calculated questions. She smiled, but it was a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Darius Bell," she began, her voice smooth and polished. "CEO of Innovis, a true American success story." Darius gave a polite nod. "Appreciate you having me." She leaned in slightly, flipping through her cue cards. "Now, let's get right into it. Your company recently landed a $200 million government contract, beating out some of the biggest names in tech. That's impressive. Darius knew this strategy well. Start by building him up and make it seem like they respected his achievements. It was a long process, he replied evenly. But yeah, we put in the work. We developed a security encryption system that outperformed our competitors. Simple as that. Madeline crossed her legs, tilting her head. Some have called it groundbreaking, a pause, just long enough to shift the energy in the room. But others have raised questions. Darius didn't flinch. Questions? She lifted a cue card. Some industry experts say Innovis benefited from federal diversity incentives, that companies like yours have an edge in these contracts because agencies are looking to diversify their vendors. Perhaps this wasn't just about being the best, but about meeting a quota. There it was, the real reason he was here. Darius let a beat pass before responding. I've heard that argument before. It's funny, though. When a black entrepreneur wins, it's special treatment. But when a legacy firm run by the same families for generations lands those same deals, nobody questions it. The air in the studio shifted. Off camera, a producer's posture stiffened. Madeline held her ground. So, you're saying race played no role at all in your success? Darius chuckled, shaking his head. Let me ask you this. When SpaceX won its NASA contracts, was it because Elon Musk met a diversity quota? When Jeff Bezos landed government deals for Blue Origin, was it because of his background? Or do we only ask that question when the CEO looks like me? Madeline's expression barely flickered, but there was a slight shift in her demeanor. She wasn't done yet. She had something else up her sleeve. Her smile sharpened like a blade wrapped in silk. She glanced at her cue cards before looking back up at Darius. Well, Darius, let's talk about that playing field you mentioned, she said, her tone turning cooler. You grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Single mother, public school, worked your way up from nothing. That's inspiring. Darius gave a slow nod. He could feel where this was going. Madeline continued, her voice laced with careful skepticism. But here's what some might wonder. How does someone with no Ivy League background, no deep family connections, go from a struggling neighborhood to securing contracts that billion-dollar corporations fail to land? She let the question linger. The implication was clear. How did you get here? Did someone pull strings? If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment one below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Darius tilted his head slightly, considering his response. It's called work, Madeline, he said, his voice steady. Some of us don't have generational wealth or country club networks to fall back on, so we build from the ground up. Madeline nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. But she wasn't done. She pressed on. But surely you had help along the way, she countered. Maybe a mentor, a program? Something that gave you an extra push? Darius exhaled slowly, a measured breath that barely made a sound. His expression remained composed, but the weight of his words carried more force than any raised voice ever could. Yeah, he said, voice steady. Help came in the form of juggling 3 jobs while grinding my way through an engineering degree. Help came in the form of sleeping in my tiny office space, if you could even call it that, while I built my first software prototype because I couldn't afford rent, let alone a real workspace. That's the kind of help I got. Across from him, Madeline's lips pressed together for the briefest of moments. A flicker of reaction she quickly smoothed away. Behind the cameras, the producers had gone still, their attention locked onto the conversation unfolding before them. The energy in the room had shifted, like the hush that comes before a storm. Madeline, ever the professional, adjusted her grip on the stack of cue cards in her hands, flipping one to the back before speaking again. And yet, she began, her tone careful, some would argue that black entrepreneurs today have more opportunities than ever before. That, compared to decades past, doors are opening in ways they never have. Programs like affirmative action, minority business grants, and government incentives exist specifically to create pathways for success. Pathways that didn't always exist. She tilted her head slightly, watching him. Some would say that the landscape has changed. Darius leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His movements were unhurried and deliberate, but the intensity in his eyes sharpened. "You know what's funny?" he asked, a hint of wry amusement threading through his words. "When a black business owner makes it, the first question people ask is always about what programs helped us get there, which diversity initiative gave us a hand, which special grant opened the door." He let that hang in the air for a moment before continuing, "But nobody ever asks which old money bank handed out a loan to a white-owned startup with no questions asked. Nobody asks which well-connected mentor got them into Stanford, or which family friend invested in their first round of funding." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick and argued, the kind of silence that comes when an uncomfortable truth is laid bare. Darius's gaze swept briefly over the studio, catching the barely perceptible shifts in posture, the way people adjusted in their seats, the way a few held their breath without realizing it. "Texas success isn't handed out like some lottery prize," he said finally. "It's earned. But for people like me, it's not just about working hard. It's about being twice as good, twice as prepared, just to get a seat at the table. And even then, some people still act like we don't belong there." A ripple of awareness moved through the room, a realization, perhaps, that they were watching something unscripted unfold, something raw, something real. But Madeline, ever composed, didn't blink. If anything, the corners of her lips curved upward in a smile, small, polished, calculated, the kind of smile a seasoned chess player gives when they think they've just put their opponent in check. "That's an interesting perspective," she said smoothly, her voice carrying the same effortless control as ever. She turned slightly toward the cameras, angling herself just so. "But let's talk about another factor, perception." Her fingers brushed against the cue cards on the table, though she didn't glance at them this time. "Darius, you present yourself as a self-made success story, and there's no denying that your journey has been remarkable. But let's examine the broader narrative for a moment. Some argue that black entrepreneurs today receive an unfair advantage when it comes to media attention. That stories like yours, stories of overcoming hardship, are seen as more marketable, more compelling, than the thousands of white business owners who put in just as much work but don't get the same headline." Darius let out a chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "Oh, so now the problem is that we get too much attention?" Observe. The shift in Madeline's posture was barely noticeable, just the subtlest straightening of her spine, the faintest tightening at the corners of her mouth. But it was there. She hadn't expected him to laugh. "You're telling me," he continued, his tone edged with disbelief, "that in a world where nearly 90% of Fortune 500 CEOs are white men, where venture capital still overwhelmingly flows into white-owned startups, the real issue, the real injustice, is that people like me get too much press?" He let the word settle, watching her carefully. Madeline maintained her poised demeanor, but a small tell betrayed her. A loose strand of hair had fallen forward, and instead of tucking it back casually, she hesitated for half a second before brushing it away. Just a fraction too deliberately. A minor detail, but Darius caught it. "I'm just pointing out," she said, her voice smooth but with a hint of insistence, "that in today's climate, some people feel there's pressure to highlight diversity over pure merit." Darius exhaled, slow and measured, shaking his head once. "Merit, right?" His eyes flickered toward the cameras before settling back on her. Let me ask you something, Madeline. Do you think that if I wasn't exceptional at what I do, I'd be sitting in this chair right now?" She parted her lips slightly, an almost imperceptible pause, but before she could respond, he pressed on. "You think I got here because I played the diversity card, or do you think I got here despite everything designed to keep me out?" The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Even the quiet hum of equipment seemed to fade into the background. For a moment, Madeline didn't speak. But she wasn't finished. Not yet, because she had one last card to play. Taking a slow breath, she shifted in her seat. Not enough to appear rattled, but just enough to readjust. A subtle move meant to maintain control. She glanced down at her cue cards one last time before setting them aside. In this next part, she wanted to deliver directly. "Darius," she said, tilting her head slightly, her tone deceptively soft, "I think it's fair to say you're passionate about this, and I respect that." A brief pause, as if she were offering a moment of acknowledgement. Then, with surgical precision, she delivered the real question. "But let me ask you something." Darius gave a slight nod, waiting. "Do you think some of this outrage is exaggerated?" She let the words breathe. After all, your success story itself is proof that the system isn't as stacked against black entrepreneurs as some claim. And just like that, the air in the room thickened again. But this time it wasn't just tension. It was the unmistakable electricity of a moment that was about to define the conversation. The audacity. Darius could feel the heat creeping up his spine, that slow burn of anger threatening to break through his carefully maintained composure. But he refused to let it show. Instead, he exhaled through his nose, a chuckle escaping as he shook his head. His fingers curled loosely together, resting on his lap as he leaned slightly forward. "You know," he said, voice steady, deliberate, "it's always fascinating how people take one single success story and hold it up as proof that a much larger systemic problem doesn't exist." Madeline's smile remained in place, professional, polished. But there was the faintest flicker in her eyes, a micro-expression that told him she had felt a shift in the conversation. He pressed forward, his words now a scalpel. "Let me put it in simpler terms. If a single person manages to crawl out of a burning building, do you look at them and say, 'See, the fire wasn't that bad'?" The edges of her smile tightened as her lips parted. She was poised to respond, but then she hesitated. A fraction of a second too long. Darius saw it, and so did the cameras. But he wasn't done. "The fact that I made it doesn't mean the system isn't broken," he continued, his voice unwavering. "It just means I had to fight twice as hard to push through it." The room was still. Even the crew members, usually bustling in the background, had paused in their movements. A charged silence had settled over the studio, the kind that made people hold their breath without realizing it. Madeline adjusted her posture, a subtle attempt to reclaim control. Her manicured fingers grazed the armrest of her chair as she adopted a measured tone, the kind used by media professionals trained in damage control. "I understand where you're coming from, Darius," she said smoothly, angling slightly toward the camera. "But let's explore another perspective here." Her pivot was strategic. "Some might argue that your frustration isn't truly about race," she continued, her voice dipping into the realm of carefully neutral, "that it's actually about your criticism of corporate structures. Specifically, your repeated claims that major tech companies aren't doing enough to hire diverse executives." Darius tilted his head slightly, considering her words. Then he offered a slow, deliberate nod. "Resentment?" he repeated. "No. Accountability? Absolutely." Madeline pressed her lips together, just for a beat, before pushing forward. "Then what do you say to those who believe that in today's economy, success is based on hard work, not race?" Darius exhaled softly through his nose. This was it, the moment. He locked eyes with her, his expression unreadable, but his presence commanding. "You say," he began, his voice quiet but weighted, "that people love to believe in fairy tales when they're the ones benefiting from them." A ripple of silence washed over the set, thick and undeniable. The kind of silence that didn't just fill a room. It settled into people's bones. the kind that made producers nervous and audiences lean forward in their seats. "But let's be real," he continued, his tone never rising, never wavering. "Black entrepreneurs still get denied loans at twice the rate of white business owners. We still receive less than 2% of venture capital funding, and even when we succeed, and we do everything right, we still get asked whether we deserved our success." Madeline sat perfectly still, nodding slightly as if absorbing his words. But Darius could see the difference between listening and hearing. And she wasn't hearing him. "So let's stop pretending the system isn't rigged," he said, his voice calm, matter-of-fact. "It is. And the only people who don't see it are the ones it works for." Another silence. A heavier one. The kind that stretched long enough to make even the most seasoned professionals squirm. The control room didn't cut to commercial. The producers didn't interrupt. This wasn't just another segment. This was raw. This was real. Madeline's posture stiffened just slightly. She glanced toward the off-Kano crew, maybe hoping for a cue, maybe just out of instinct. But there was no rescue coming. She had walked into this, and now she had to sit in it. Darius adjusted his watch, his movements slow, intentional, letting the silence breathe. Then he leaned back in his chair and exhaled. "You know what the real problem is?" His voice was softer now, almost contemplative, but it carried more weight than ever. If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment one below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Madeline hesitated. "What?" Darius didn't blink. "The bar isn't in the same place for everyone." She shifted slightly, tilting her head. "Meaning?" "I mean," he said, each word deliberate, "a mediocre white man can fail upwards in this country, but a brilliant black man has to jump through flaming hoops just to get a shot." A producer off-camera cursed under their breath. They knew this was going viral. Darius pressed forward, his tone conversational but edged with something unshakable. "A white CEO can run a company into the ground, bankrupt it, lay off thousands of employees, and still land another high-paying job in 6 months. Meanwhile, a black CEO has one bad quarter, and suddenly it's proof that we weren't ready for leadership." Madeline opened her mouth, perhaps to counter, perhaps to redirect, but Darius wasn't done. "The best part?" He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "When we make it, people like you sit across from us and ask if we got here because of some special advantage." Silence. Madeline's jaw tightened, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but the camera caught it. Darius leaned forward just slightly, not aggressive, just firm, just final. "You wanted to talk about fairness?" He let out a soft, bitter chuckle. "Then let's start by telling the truth." Another silence, but this one was different. It wasn't discomfort anymore. It was impact. It was something shifting in the air, something settling into the consciousness of everyone watching. Madeline's expression had changed. The audience wasn't just watching Darius anymore. The entire country was. And then, the moment. Darius turned slightly, looking straight into the camera, his gaze unwavering. "I know what some of you are thinking right now," he said. "Some of you are nodding because you've seen this, lived this." His voice remained steady, but there was something heavier beneath it now. "And some of you are sitting there, frowning, arms crossed, telling yourself this isn't real, that I'm just playing victim, that it's all in my head." He paused, letting it settle. His lips pressed together briefly before he finished. "But deep down, you know I'm right." The studio was still. No one moved, no one breathed. Then, "All right, we need to take a quick break," the producer's voice crackled over the speakers. Madeline forced a polite smile. "We'll be back with more after this." The cameras cut, but the damage was done. Within an hour, the clip was everywhere. By the time Darius was in his car, his phone was blowing up. Texts, missed calls, notifications flooding his screen. Twitter was on fire. Darius Bell just exposed the media's bias on live TV. This was powerful. Truth hurts. The way he looked into the camera and called out America, chills. And the one that stuck with him the most. Darius Bell was right. But not everyone saw it that way. As soon as the interview aired, the backlash was swift and unforgiving. The internet lit up with sharp critiques and dismissive takes. Here we go again, another successful guy pretending to be oppressed. Cry me a river. Stop playing the victim. Wow, this guy just proved why people don't like hiring activists. Play the race card all you want, but hard work speaks louder. Merit matters. Within the hour, cable news had picked up the story, amplifying the debate. Some commentators called him courageous for speaking his truth. Others accused him of being combative, divisive, and even ungrateful. By lunchtime, the Morning Exchange released a carefully crafted statement. We value open dialogue and diverse perspectives. While today's discussion became more intense than expected, we stand by our commitment to fair conversations. Darius scoffed when he read it. Fair, right? His phone buzzed almost immediately. It was his assistant, Tasha, her voice a mixture of amusement and exasperation. Do you realize you just set the internet on fire? Darius rubbed his temples, already feeling the weight of what was coming. That wasn't exactly my intention. Well, congratulations. You just became the most talked about entrepreneur in America. He didn't reply. He didn't have to. He had seen this play out before. A viral moment wasn't just a moment. It was a battlefield. And once you were in the center of it, you either stood your ground or got swallowed by the wave. The next 48 hours were going to be brutal. If you are still watching this video and found this story helpful, please comment 3 below to let me know you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. By the next morning, the firestorm had spread beyond social media. Every major news network had an angle. Cable news anchors debated his words, dissecting every sentence, every expression, every pause. Opinion pieces flooded the internet, each one offering a different spin on the controversy. Fox News. Is Darius Bell the new face of corporate entitlement? CNN. Darius Bell's viral moment, a reckoning for America's meritocracy. Business Insider, what Darius Bell's interview reveals about race and success in America. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, damage control was already in motion. Madeleine Royce, the journalist who had conducted the interview, was prepared. On her show the next morning, she delivered a carefully rehearsed monologue. I respect Mr. Bell and his accomplishments, she began, her tone measured. But I stand by my questions. My job as a journalist is to ask what the audience is thinking. If my questions were uncomfortable, that only proves how necessary they were. Translation, she wasn't backing down. Darius watched from his office, shaking his head as her words played across the screen. It was the same script he had seen before. Reframe, deflect, control the narrative. Across from him, Tasha sat at her desk, scrolling through an avalanche of emails. She said, looking up, we just got a flood of new investor inquiries. Darius raised an eyebrow. Let me guess. The same people who ignored us last year? Tasha shrugged. Guess being controversial is good for business. But it wasn't all good news. While some doors opened, others slammed shut. A few long-time clients quietly pulled out of contracts. A major corporate partner sent a vague but telling message about reevaluating our commitments. And then there were the threats. Emails, anonymous phone calls, veiled warnings. The most unsettling was an unmarked package left outside Innovi's headquarters. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one word printed in bold capital letters. Tasha frowned as she read the message. You need security. Darius exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. He had known this was coming. It was the inevitable price of speaking too boldly, too unapologetically, a cost that for black men like him was almost always part of the equation. But backing down, that was never an option. And now, he had a choice to make. Would he let the backlash silence him? Or was this just the beginning of something bigger? That night, as the city skyline stretched beyond his office windows, he sat in silence, turning the events over in his mind. The last 72 hours had been a blur, a storm of praise, backlash, threats, and opportunities. He thought about his younger self, the kid from Birmingham who had to fight for every inch of success. The one who watched doors slam shut in his face while others walked through without knocking. The one who had been told to be grateful, to keep his head down, to never make waves. And now here he was, at the center of a national debate he never asked for, but one he couldn't ignore. Tasha entered the room, her expression unreadable. She placed a folder on his desk. "We just got an offer." Darius arched an eyebrow. "From who?" "The network. They want you to do a televised special, a one-on-one deep dive about race, business, and the system." Darius let out a slow breath, staring at the folder before him. "So now, they want to listen?" Tasha smirked. "Seems like it." Then, after a pause, she asked, "What do you want to do?" He leaned back in his chair, considering his options. He could walk away, let the noise die down, and tee back to business. Or he could use this moment, not for clout, not for attention, but to say the things nobody wanted to hear. Finally, he picked up the folder, flipping through the proposal. Then he set it down and met Tasha's gaze. "Tell them I'll do it." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "You sure?" He nodded. "Yeah. But on my terms. Because if the system was going to put him under a spotlight, he was damn sure going to control the narrative." Darius Bell's viral moment wasn't just another internet controversy. It was a reckoning. It forced a conversation people had been dodging for decades. About race, about success, about who gets to rise without question, and who gets questioned when they rise. Some called him an activist, some called him arrogant, some called him right. But one thing was certain. Nobody could ignore him anymore. Thank you for watching this powerful story of Darius Bell and his viral moment on the Morning Exchange. We've witnessed how one man's courage and unapologetic honesty forced the world to take a hard look at the biases within our system. So what have you learned from this intense exchange? How do you think the conversation about race, success, and fairness should evolve in today's world? I'd love to hear from you. Comment below and share one key lesson you've taken from this story that you'll bring into your own life. If you liked this video, please leave a comment, give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more thought-provoking content like this.